Hello and welcome everyone to your week 11 lecture. Our lecture is going to be on inherited metabolic disorders and particularly focusing on phenylketonuria. All right, and this is just a generic website that I wanted to share with you, which guides you regarding what is phenylketonuria, the basic nutrition management plan. It is kind of used as a valuable patient education resource for, say, dietitians to study and then to educate their patients about PKU. So this website is just an FYI. It is sort of a pre-reading where you can just browse over it and then you can attend the lecture, but it's not compulsory. It's just an FYI. Okay. All right. So yep, these are your learning objectives. You essentially don't have any pre-readings for this lecture. So lucky you. Okay. So we'll start from this slide. So basically what is nutrition related inborn errors of metabolism? Basically what this means is that you can digest the nutrient, absorb the nutrient, but you cannot metabolize the nutrient. Metabolism of a nutrient will happen within the cell. All right. So when the nutrient enters the cell, that is when it starts creating problem because it cannot be metabolized. So the example which we are taking for this lecture, and this concept is very new for a lot of undergraduate students if you haven't heard of phenylketonuria. So basically you have an amino acid called phenylalanine. So yes, you can digest and you can absorb phenylalanine, but when it enters the cell, you cannot metabolize phenylalanine. What exactly do we mean by metabolism of phenylalanine? We'll come through that later on in the slides. But yes, when you cannot metabolize it, that is when you have the disease condition called as phenylketonuria. All right. So now there are two concepts with nutrient and gene interaction. The first one is called as nutrient genetics and the other one nutrient genomics. Okay, so what is nutrient genetics? That is how genes are affecting diet. Meaning there are say XYZ faulty gene, all right, which a person is, say, for example, born with, and therefore they have to change their diet because of their genetic makeup. So for instance, PKU patients, phenylketonuria patients, they cannot have phenylalanine in their diet. Why? Because they cannot metabolize it, and therefore now their dietary habits have to be changed because they are born with such a genetic makeup where they cannot metabolize phenylalanine. Similarly, when you have, for example, individuals who are born with type 1 diabetes, all right, so it is because they genetically cannot, say, synthesize or produce any insulin, therefore they have to change their diet. So because of genes, when you are changing your diet, that is called as nutrigenetics in simple terms. Okay, now you have nutrigenomics. What is nutrigenomics? When diet is affecting genetics. And this a key example which we have learned across several lectures is epigenetics. Okay, so yes, so basically the diets have been such for a long period of time, saturated fat, trans fat, leading to inflammation, changing the genetic makeup of the individual, all right, causing CVD, atherosclerosis, arthritis, all the other inflammatory conditions, which I had mentioned in your diabetes lecture. So basically nutrigenomic means when your diet has been faulty and now this is affecting your genes. Okay, so for example, when a mother's diet is faulty, and that may affect the baby's gene, epigenetics is what you studied, or when your own diet is faulty, which is causing underlying inflammation, because of which now the individual has having various disease condition. So this is basically nutrigenomics is where you have the external factor first, meaning the diet changing the genetic composition, all right, and therefore the disease happening. So that is the difference between nutrigenetics and nutrigenomics. Okay, so now there are two types of basically genetic disorders, roughly speaking. You have autosomal recessive disorder. So now in autosomal recessive disorder, just look where my mouse is hovering. So this is called autosomal recessive disorder, in which you can have parents being the carrier of the faulty gene. Okay, so the parents are not affected by the disease, meaning they are not affected by PKU, but maybe they are carrying a genetic strain in which their children are likely to have PKU. Okay, so in this, you have both parents, they are carrying a faulty gene. Okay, both of these parents are carrying a faulty gene. Therefore, there is 1 in 4 chance, meaning 25% chance that a child who is born to this parent may have full-blown PKU. Full-blown PKU meaning where the PKU gene is dominant in the child is actually exhibiting signs and symptoms of phenylketonuria. All right, so that is where it may become dominant. There are 50% chances that parents who are carrying the gene, their children may also be gene carriers, but still it is recessive, meaning they do not have full-blown PKU. They are not exhibiting signs and symptoms of PKU. Okay, and then you have 25% chance where the child is completely healthy, not at all affected by PKU, and not even carrying a recessive gene. Okay, so that is called as autosomal recessive disorder. Now you have autosomal dominant disorder, in which you have one parent who has PKU. Okay, so for example, a individual who has PKU and who is having a partner who is completely healthy, not a carrier of the gene, does not have PKU whatsoever. Now, when they have children, there is a 50% chance that their children will also have full-blown PKU. Okay, so they would be exhibiting signs and symptoms of PKU, and there is a 50% chance that the children will be completely healthy, not carriers, and definitely not having PKU as well. Okay, so this is called as autosomal dominant disorder. All right. So now the history of newborn screening, NBS. Okay, so what is NBS? So basically there was a scientist called Robert Guthrie. That is him over here in this picture. So this scientist, he developed a testing measure to identify newborn babies if they're suffering from PKU or not. Why is it so important to have such early diagnosis, meaning a child being born and you want to diagnose whether the child has PKU? Because guys, now think about a newborn baby. Obviously, the newborn baby is not going to start eating family foods, right? What is the very first food that a newborn baby will have? In almost all cases, it's going to be breast milk, right? Or for some reason, if mother cannot breastfeed, all right, any sort of say medical, psychosocial reason, something or the other, what would the family do for the child? It would be some sort of milk-based formula, something like that. And as you know, milk in any source, be it breast milk or be it say formula feeding or bottle feeding. Now, milk is a good quality source of protein, right? When I say good quality source of protein, a dietary protein, meaning they have all essential amino acids. And phenylalanine is an essential amino acid, meaning your milk has essential amino acid, be it breast milk or be it bottle feeding. All right. So now when, for example, if the baby has PKU, all right, and the baby is having say breast milk and the baby is having say maybe bottle feeding, all right. So now this baby who's having this protein rich milk, okay, with PKU, now they will be at very high risk of say their health being deteriorated if they are not diagnosed and identified as having PKU early on in life. All right, it can be so fatal that the baby can die, or else it can be fatal in the sense it can lead to say lifelong disability, cognitive, neurocognitive disabilities, and we will look at the signs and symptoms of PKU. But basically, yes, it can cause a lot of health issues for the baby, which are lifelong or which could be fatal in nature. Therefore, it is very important to identify specific genetic metabolic conditions as soon as the baby is born. Therefore, Robert Guthrie, he introduced newborn screening. So what did newborn screening do? What do they do? And which is what they do in the hospitals even now, all right? And in United States, in several states, you have newborn screening, which is completely mandatory, all right? So this is much more strict, and the research which I share with you is coming a lot from the US, all right? So over there, newborn screening is mandatory. In all developed country, newborn screening is done. It is offered. All right. So, but in Australia, it is not mandatory. For example, when you have newborn, you have these parents in the hospital, and when they are offered that would you like your baby to be newborn screened? All right. So, can we do newborn screening on your baby? Of course, the medical health professionals, they explain the advantages of this, and they encourage the new parents to have their newborn screening done for their baby. However, in Australia, you have a choice to reject and not go for newborn screening, which is not beneficial. All right. So yes, you may think, oh, none of my family has any metabolic disorder, then why should I be worried about it? But you never know, guys. It's always good to get this test done. All right. It is free of cost. Okay. It is offered by all hospitals in developed countries, whereas in developing countries, you have to pay for this. All right. And it is not mandatory. So over here, you have a governmental, say, support healthcare system where you have the choice of doing this, whereas in the US, no choice, you have to do it. Okay, so yes, newborn screening, it is done in all developed countries. So basically what is done, so if you can see this, you do a heel prick test for the baby. Okay, so you prick the heel and you take small blood samples on this blotting paper. And then these blood samples are analyzed for various sort of metabolic disorders, not just PKU. Okay, so basically in 2005, the American College of Medical Genetics, ACMG, that is what it is called, they recommended 29 conditions, metabolic conditions, genetic metabolic conditions, which require compulsory screening. Okay, so these 29 conditions you can identify from this small little droplets of blood. Okay, you can identify whether the baby is suffering from any of these 29 conditions. Okay, other 25 conditions are not mandatory. Okay, they are offered by some hospitals or some states in the United States and not by the other. There are a lot of combinations, but 29 are core conditions which are mandatory. Okay, so guys, if this is not clear, rest assured, just click on this link over here. Okay, I have given you these links and it has these conditions. So these are your 29 conditions, which are genetic metabolic conditions, which are screened for. There are a lot of nutrition related genetic metabolic conditions within these 29 conditions as well. For example, medium chain acyl-CoA dehydrogenase deficiency, very long chain and long chain CoA dehydrogenase deficiency. So these are, say, fatty acid. Okay, so these are metabolic disorders related to fatty acid. So you have these. You obviously have phenylketonuria in this as well. You have tyrosinemia in this. Okay, so you have many conditions in these 29 conditions which are dietary in nature. All right. So now the prevalence of PKU. So the incidence roughly around the globe is 1 in 20. And if you see in Australia, it is 1 in 15,000 babies. The incidence is more common among, say, Caucasians, okay, white infants from European descent, okay, as compared to, say, Asians or Africans or Hispanics. It's less common among this population. Not saying that it does not happen. It does happen. Okay, but yes, the incidence rate is much higher among the Caucasian populations. Okay, so now guys, this is an FYI for you that these are your amino acids. Okay, these are your essential amino acids. These are conditionally essential, meaning they can be made in the body if you have essential amino acids. And these are non-essential, meaning they can be synthesized by the body. Okay, so yes, these essential amino acids we cannot synthesize in the body, therefore we need it in the diet. And the problematic one in phenylketonuria is phenylalanine. All right. Okay, so now guys, as I said, phenylalanine is an essential amino acid, meaning you need it in your diet. All right, most people like you and me, we can metabolize phenylalanine easily. Okay, we need an enzyme and a cofactor to metabolize our phenylalanine. The enzyme is called as phenylalanine hydroxylase and the coenzyme is called as tetrahydrobiopterin, okay, BH4. Yes, you need to know the term, okay, before you ask me. All right. So yes, basically when you do not have this enzyme or a cofactor, or else you have limited amount of the enzyme or cofactor, that is when the individual exhibits PKU symptoms. Why? Because phenylalanine level, it increases in the blood. When you have lot of phenylalanine floating in the blood, it crosses your blood-brain barrier, and the concept of blood-brain barrier we have covered in detail in the liver lecture. All right, so yes, it crosses the blood-brain barrier, And when you have so much of phenylalanine in the brain, it can cause a lot of neurocognitive issues. Okay, so guys, this is the basic concept of inborn error of metabolism. All right, so you have, for example, you have a substrate, okay, and if you have the sufficient enzyme. So think of your substrate as your phenylalanine. All right, then you have the enzyme for it, okay, meaning phenylalanine hydroxylase, and you have tetrahydrobiopterin as well. Okay, so you have both of this in sufficient amount. If you do have this, then phenylalanine is easily converted to tyrosine in the body. Okay, but having said that, you have enough amount of enzyme and your cofactor. All right, sorry about that. So now on the second side, you have no amount of enzyme and or cofactor. Okay, in this case, your phenylalanine is just floating in the blood. It's not getting converted to tyrosine. Or else you can have a third condition in which you have very, very limited amount of phenylalanine and or tetrahydrobiopterin, and therefore you have very little amount of tyrosine which is produced, and a lot of phenylalanine is still floating in the blood. Okay, so that is called partial enzyme impairment, enzyme or cofactor impairment in this case, or else you have severe enzyme impairment, all right, or cofactor impairment. And this is the normal condition which is for most of the people like you and me. Okay, all right. So now what's your metabolic pathway? You have phenylalanine, as I said, which is converted to tyrosine if you have sufficient amount of phenylalanine hydroxylase and tetrahydrobiopterin. Okay, but when you do not have phenylalanine hydroxylase and or tetrahydrobiopterin, then this conversion may not happen at all, or it may not happen to sufficient level, meaning what is the end result? You have very, very high amount of phenylalanine floating in the blood, and you have less amount of tyrosine. And tyrosine is, as you can see in this condition, it's a conditionally essential amino acid. Okay, so what does it mean? It means that if you had phenylalanine sufficient in your body with the enzyme and cofactor, you can easily synthesize tyrosine. But now tyrosine becomes essential for PKU patients. Why? Because they cannot eat phenylalanine. All right. If they are not consuming phenylalanine in the diet, then they definitely need tyrosine in the diet, because now tyrosine becomes essential for these individuals. It is no longer conditionally essential. Okay, so now what happens when you have low plasma tyrosine level? Okay, so when you have low tyrosine, basically what are the key functions of tyrosine? Tyrosine is very important for melanin synthesis, and you know melanin is the one which gives our skin coloration. All right, so yes, you have less melanin synthesis, meaning PKU patients generally have a very, very fair and pale looking skin. All right, then you have decrease in thyroid hormone. And you know, your thyroid hormone is the key hormone, okay, which is responsible for maintaining your metabolism. Okay, so for example, the energy which is required for your RMR, all right, all of your involuntary activities in the body. We have spoken a lot about thyroid hormone in your obesity lecture. Okay, so yes, now when your thyroid hormone is suffering, okay, your basic metabolic cycles are suffering. Therefore, these individuals are very likely to easily put on weight, or else they could be overweight and obese. Okay, then you have, say you have less catecholamines, which are, say, secreted by tyrosine. Okay, so now catecholamines, they are neurotransmitters. Okay, they are very important for neurological functioning, maintaining mood, maintaining behavior. Okay, and even say reflexes like your muscle control and reflexes. All right, so all of these neurological, say, impairments are seen in a individual who has, say, PKU. All right, and tyrosine produces intermediates of your TCA cycle or your energy cycle. Okay, like your fumarate and your acetyl-CoA. All right, so now basically what does it mean? It means the efficiency with which you produce energy will also be impaired. So you have fatigue, you have lethargy, you have less amount of nutrients being metabolized for energy purposes, more fat storage purposes, and on the contrary, you are highly likely to gain weight because you have thyroid hormone dysfunctioning. Okay, so does that make sense, guys? So these are the kind of, say, signs and symptoms which you see in a PKU patients, which are secondary to low tyrosine levels in the body. Okay, so now when we look at, guys, the signs and symptoms of untreated cases, as I said, the individuals could be very fair and pale looking. So not only their skin, but even their hair and blue eyes because of lack of melanin pigment. Okay, so depigmentation. Then you have developmental delays like failure to thrive, all right, not reaching your optimum height, for example. All right, you could experience, these patients could experience overweight and obesity. And why is that? Because now we know that thyroid hormone is not being synthesized properly, and which we know is your king of your hormones in terms of, say, metabolic regulations. Okay, then you have cognitive impairments. Yes, you have cognitive impairments due to catecholamine not being synthesized, but also because essentially you have a lot of phenylalanine which is crossing your blood-brain barrier, and this in itself can cause a lot of cognitive impairments, such as mental difficulties, learning difficulties, all right? Then you have microcephaly, small head size. Then you have skin issues which are seen in this individuals like eczema, skin rash, right? Then you have biochemical issues. Why? Because a lot of phenylalanine is there in the blood. And as I said, what is the rule of the body? Once your blood is saturated with, say, a compound, then you see that eliminated in the urine. So when you have phenyl ketone bodies being eliminated in the urine, they give you this musty urine odor. Okay, and of course biochemical changes are, you have high blood phenylalanine level, just like how you do blood sugar level testing for diabetes. Similarly, phenylketonuria patients have to do phenylalanine level testing of their blood. Okay, then you have neurological issues such as seizures, right? This again is because of phenylalanine crossing the blood-brain barrier essentially, and of course because of catecholamine as well. But predominantly, guys, neurological issues are essentially because of the crossing of phenylalanine across the blood-brain barrier. All right, so yes, ideally treatment should start as soon as possible, all right, before 3 weeks of age, to prevent any irreversible neurological and cognitive disability. Guys, you can have a very, very good quality of life of patients if they are identified earlier, and if they are, say, supported in a better manner with their dietary and medical foods. Okay, so guys, as you can see, nutrition related genetic metabolic disorders like PKU, they are highly dependent on dietary management. Okay, you need to remove the phenylalanine from the diet, all right, or you need to lower the phenylalanine in the diet for them to have a healthy quality of life. So yes, it can be managed. An individual can have a good quality of life. However, early identification, very important. Okay, and associated management as well, of course. All right, because yes, if you manage early, a lot of people have very good, say, mental and physical ability, cognitive ability. We have in the United States, as I said, I thought that this sort of lecture is so very much important to be studied by the undergraduate and postgraduate students majoring in nutrition. Because guys, when I was in the US, my work was in nutrition genetics, and it was in the area of phenylketonuria. And we have seen a lot of patients who have fantastic quality of life. They go to do university degrees, they go to study, say, higher education and research. So they have fantastic quality of life, but they do very, very good management. So just like, for example, diabetes, for instance, with type 1 diabetes. So now type 1 diabetes, we know, can be managed with excellence. All right, and you can have a fantastic quality of life. Similarly, PKU can be managed very, very well, and you will not have neurological and cognitive impairment in these individuals. However, you need to be mindful about their management. Okay, and early diagnosis. Okay, so how does nutrition relate to treatment of PKU? So as I have emphasized, this is a nutrition-related genetic metabolic disorder, and nutrition plays a very important role. And we'll see how. Okay, so now guys, just I wanted to share this with you, and this is available on Google freely everywhere, this image. Okay, these are brother, this is say sibling pair. Okay, so brother and sister. So the brother was is an elder brother, and the brother was not identified as having PKU. Okay, so the parents did not know what's happening, and PKU was never tested. But then they identified that the brother has PKU, but very, very late in life. and therefore the child suffers severe, you can say, physical impairments, neurological and cognitive impairments. And you see the sister over here, she actually has PKU. So she has a dominant gene, she is having PKU, but you see she is not suffering from PKU because PKU in this child is managed well. All right, so with good dietary management, with good clinical management, these children can have excellent quality of life throughout life. Okay, not just during their childhood, but throughout life. Just like with type 1 diabetes or any other chronic health disorder, they can have excellent quality of life if they are given good management. All right, so you see the difference over here. So yes, so this is just an FYI for you that objectives are lifetime care. So this is just like diabetes, you need lifetime care. Dietary management, very, very important. Why? Because this is a nutrition related genetic metabolic disorder. Yes, regular blood tests are needed, just like how you would be checking blood sugar level in type 1 diabetes. Similarly, you need to check blood phenylalanine levels in PKU patients. And of course, you will have frequent clinical visits as well. All right, so what is the diet therapy entailing? The diet therapy entails two important things. One is medical foods. What are medical foods? I'll share that with you. And the second one is low protein diet. And when I talk about dietary proteins, the terminology which I'll be using over here is called as intact proteins. Okay. So this is very important, guys. So in this space, genetic metabolic nutrition, when I talk about intact proteins, because that is the terminology we use, this refers to dietary proteins. Okay. Then you have medical therapy as well. For example, you have enzyme therapies and cofactor therapies, such as you have Kuvan. So basically, when I was working in Emory University in US as a postdoc, there were RCT trials which were already done on the effectiveness of Kuvan. Kuvan basically is the company name of your cofactor tetrahydrobiopterin. So basically they were having tablets of tetrahydrobiopterin, and individuals who are responsive to tetrahydrobiopterin, meaning they are having PKU symptoms because of low cofactor, their quality of life was improved by having tetrahydrobiopterin. Okay, and then you have the other thing which was approved by the FDA, and it was under an double-blind randomized control trial, was PECPAL. Okay, so what is PECPAL? I'll give you a brief idea about it later on. All right, so basically these were the, basically PECPAL is called as phenylalanine lyase. So what is, let me just share it with you right now because it's exciting. Okay, so what is PECPAL? It is called as phenylalanine lyase. So it is the synthetic form or the industry made form of the enzyme phenylalanine hydroxylase. So, you know, the natural enzyme that you and me carry is called phenylalanine hydroxylase, which will help in the conversion of phenylalanine to tyrosine. But if you do not have phenylalanine hydroxylase or you have less amounts of it, then they were given intravenous injections. Okay, so just like how you have insulin injections and then you have insulin pumps. So similarly, the same concept was under RCT trial for phenylalanine lyase to see if this can be commercially marketed as like an insulin therapy for type 1 diabetes. Similarly, PECPAL therapy for PKU patients. Okay, so you take the phenylalanine lyase intravenous injections, and maybe if it was successful, you can actually make PECPAL pumps out of it. All right, so this would then help in management of PKU. Okay, so that trial was under investigation. So just sharing with you, this is the rough management plan for a PKU patient. Okay, so now guys, this is the rough classification of PKU. Now please be mindful that the optimum blood level for your phenylalanine levels is between 3 to 6 mg%, okay, which is 120 to 360 micromole per liter. All right, so just like how I taught you HbA1c level less than 6.5%. Similarly over here with diabetes, I taught you that, right? So similarly over here, your blood phenylalanine level should be between 3 to 6 mg%. If it is more than that, meaning, yes, PKU is a concern. Okay, high blood phenylalanine level is a concern. And now you know why. When you have very high level of blood phenylalanine, blood-brain barrier, and the biggest thing which we are concerned in this patients is not just simple weight gain. We are concerned about neurological and cognitive impairment, okay? Because these can be lifelong impairment, and this can definitely severely impact the quality of life, highly detrimental. When an individual does not have the cognitive capacity to function independently as, say, an adult, as an individual, or not just as an adult, even as a child in their cohort. Okay, so that is when you have lifelong impairments, and as a dietitian, you're very, very mindful to maintain these levels, because you do not want to see neurological and cognitive impairment in your patients. Okay, so now guys, when you have blood levels greater than 360, so say from 360 to 900, this is called as mild PKU. Okay, then comes moderate PKU, and then comes very, very severe PKU. Okay, when your blood phenylalanine level are greater than 120 micromole per liter. All right, so when you have mild PKU, you have say around normal dietary restrictions. Okay, so 400 to 600 dietary phenylalanine levels are tolerated, meaning how much of phenylalanine are you having in your diet. Okay, so that is 400 to 600 milligram per day of phenylalanine is what is tolerated. Then you have your moderate PKU, in which your dietary restriction of phenylalanine is much more stronger. And then you have severe PKU, where the dietary restriction of phenylalanine is even more stronger. Okay, so this is what the diagram is trying to say. Okay. Now you go to recommended intakes of phenylalanine. Okay, so what is the recommended intake of phenylalanine? Now, as I said, guys, you have to appreciate a lot of this research is coming from the United States. Okay, so these guidelines are based upon what is studied in the United States. Okay, because this is still a developing concept within the Australian setting, but the say very, very early research, it started in the US. Okay, so you have, say, approximately 1 gram of protein gives you roughly 50 milligram of phenylalanine. Now, guys, please note, this is a approximation. Okay, meaning when you cannot really take the food sample and analyze in the lab and give you the perfect values of phenylalanine, when your patient is just telling you, yeah, they had 2 cookies and they had, say, 1 cup of milk and things, and you have to say, do rough calculations of phenylalanine, that is when you will use this approximation. If you compare, say, a low protein food phenylalanine levels, and you back calculate it with this 1 gram of protein is equal to 50 milligram of phenylalanine, your calculations will not give you the exact number which is there in the nutritional label. Why? Because this was done in a lab in which you came to know the exact level of phenylalanine. This approximation is used when you do not have FoodWorks, when you do not have a software on hand, and you have to roughly calculate what is your patient having. Okay, so these are your, this is when you have no tool, this is your tool. 1 gram of protein giving you approximately 50 milligrams of phenylalanine. All right, so now, for example, with say for ages greater than 4 years to adults, what is encouraged is, for instance, they have proteins, say, because proteins will make more sense to you. So let me go on that first. So they can have roughly 4 to 22 grams of protein per day, okay, to maintain their blood Phe levels between 3 to 6 milligram per cent. Now, please be mindful. Do they have 4 grams of protein, or can they have 22 grams of protein? That depends upon their blood phenylalanine levels. If their blood phenylalanine levels are, say, approximately 1250 micromole per liter, obviously they will not be having 22 milligrams of protein, the 22 grams of protein. Okay, they will be having much lower dietary protein or intact proteins. Okay, so this, the first thing which I'm talking about is intact proteins, proteins which are coming from the diet. How much of protein can a PKU patient tolerate in his or her diet is roughly between 4 to 22 grams. Do you go to 4 grams, or do you go to 14 grams, or do you give them 22 grams? That a dietitian decides depending upon their blood phenylalanine levels. Okay, so I hope this makes clear sense. So 4 to 22 grams of protein per day roughly gives you, say, 200 to 1100 milligrams per day of phenylalanine. All right, so now you have, say, what is their dietary recommended intake? This, the first thing which I'm talking about, this first, if you see my mouse where it's hovering, This first section is about the amount of intact protein that they can tolerate in their diet, because as you know, they cannot have very, very high protein in their diet. Okay, because high protein in their diet meaning high phenylalanine, and we know what happens. Okay, so this is what they can tolerate in their diet. Now, what is their dietary recommended intake? Okay, so the dietary recommended intake is 120 to 140% more than the dietary recommended intake for an average individual regarding proteins gram per kg per day. And I have shown you a working example of this. What exactly do I mean? Okay. So now, for example, guys, if you have an adult male, okay, who's 31 years of age, their dietary recommended intake of protein, this is just a normal healthy adult, okay, grams per day is 56. So a adult male who's 31 years of age, they would roughly need say 56 grams of protein per day. Okay, so now this is a normal healthy adult who needs say 56 grams of protein per day. All right, but say this I have calculated using the DRI which were there for the US, because this is taken from the US. But for example, if you do not have this handy, look at the Australian, say, guidelines, which are so simple. 0.8 to 1 grams of protein for a normal healthy adult is what you need. So if I am 50 kg, hypothetically speaking, okay, and if I say I need 1 gram of protein per kg per day, meaning I need roughly 50 grams of protein per kg per day. Okay, so I need total 50 grams of protein in a day. So think of it that way. All right, so now if we look at a normal healthy male, he needs around say 56 grams of protein per day. But a PKU patient of the same gender, male, and who's 31 years of age, okay, so all other baseline characteristics are same. Now this individual will not need 56 grams of protein. This PKU individual will need approximately 120 to 140% more of the RDA. So what is 120, 140% more of 56? It is 67 to 78 grams of protein they need per day. Now imagine they can only tolerate maximum of 22 grams of protein in a day. Okay, and minimum around say 4. Okay, so what they can eat from the diet, dietary protein, is only 4 to 22 grams of protein. But what they need for their sustainability and for their health is 67 to 78 grams of protein. All right. Why is it that they have such high number? Why is it that they need so much amount of protein? Okay. One of the key reasons being, guys, is to do with medical foods. What are medical foods? I'll come to that very, very soon. But as you can see, they cannot have a lot of protein from their diet. They need to have protein from medical foods. And why do they need such high amount of protein in their diet? The total protein which they are eating, for example, an adult male 31 years of age who has PKU, he needs approximately 67 to 78 grams of protein. But a healthy male of same age, not having PKU, needs only 56 grams of protein. Why do they need higher protein, the PKU individual? Because of medical foods. And why? We'll see that very soon. Okay, but I hope you understand this slide well, guys. Okay, this is important. Okay, now medical foods. All right, so guys, as I say, from the diet, they can only have say 4 to 22 grams of protein. But as we see, they need approximately 78 grams of protein. So where is the remaining protein coming from? The remaining protein is coming from medical foods, okay, or medical formulas. All right, so in a PKU individual's diet, 80% of their protein needs are met via medical foods, and only 20% of protein needs are coming from intact proteins or dietary proteins. Okay, so now if you look at an overall individual's diet, a PKU individual's diet, then 85% is roughly fat and carbohydrate, 15% is say protein, and within this 15%, if you see, 80% is medical foods and 20% is from dietary protein. Okay, roughly speaking. All right, so now guys, why is it that these individual, so if we say they need 80% from medical foods and 20% from protein, yeah, okay, why? You would have told me from the 56 grams of protein they need, From this 56, just take it the same ratio, 20% intact and 80% medical foods. Why are you giving them so much more amount of protein? Guys, because of bioavailability. Okay, and I have spoken about the concept of bioavailability in couple of your lectures. All right, so now what does the concept say? So basically, guys, the protein which they are having from medical foods, because the bioavailability of proteins from medical foods is not as good as intact proteins, they are losing a lot of that protein. Therefore, finally, what is available to them is much, much less if we go with the ratio of, okay, 56 grams of protein now divided into 20-80 ratio. If you do that, they will not be having 56 grams of protein in their diet. They may be only having, say, around 32 grams or 30 grams of protein in the diet, because everything else is lost, because medical foods have low bioavailability. That is why they need, you put them at a higher intake, which is say 78 grams, all right, for them to at least have that amount of protein finally in the day. Okay, so to suffice bioavailability, when we say have approximately say 78 grams of protein, then you will come down to the ratio of say having 60 grams of protein in your diet. Okay, therefore they have given a range. So 120 to 140 grams. All right. Of course, there are current research which are going on in the area of PKU, where they are trying to make medical foods using intact proteins, okay, but which does not have phenylalanine in it. These are called as glycomacropeptides. Okay, so they are trying to make medical foods using glycomacropeptides. All right, so now these kind of say medical foods, or these kind of say medical formulas, they will have say intact proteins which are more bioavailable compared to say the ordinary medical formula which you get in today's market. And therefore, probably in the future, maybe after 10 to 15 years, this 120 to 140% of RDA will go down, and you will be able to easily say the same thing, that a healthy adult male requires 56 grams of protein. Even a PKU patient requires 56 grams of protein. However, within this 56 grams, let us distribute it the same way as we have always done, 20% intact and 80% medical foods. But now these medical foods, they are made up of intact protein which do not have the phenylalanine. Therefore, they are more bioavailable. Okay. But that is wishful thinking. Right now, things are still under research. All right. And another important point, guys, is with medical foods. Right now, the medical foods which are available in the market, why are they not as bioavailable? Because these medical foods have hydrolyzed proteins in them. Okay, so they are say they are available in the elemental amino acid form. You know how we spoke about enteral and parenteral feeds, and I told you about hydrolyzable feeds, okay, which have elemental amino acids, meaning currently the amino acids which are present in these medical formulas, they are say lysine, leucine, valine, things like that. Okay, so they are elemental in nature. They are not intact proteins. All right, and therefore they are less bioavailable. Okay, so yes, it has a lot to do with bioavailability of medical formulas, and hence this is the recommendation for now. Okay, so now you understand this slide, guys. This is an FYI, guys. So now you have low protein foods. Okay, so you actually have food industries which have designed foods such as low protein pasta, low protein peanut butter, low protein cheese, low protein say you have say cookies and biscuits, and low protein a lot of things. Okay, so basically you have food industries which are designing these low protein foods, but please be mindful that these are pretty expensive. Okay, so for example, just a normal pasta which you get from Woolworths and Coles, 1 cup has 324 milligrams of phenylalanine, but a low protein pasta will have 15 milligram of phenylalanine for the same cup size. Okay, so you see that these are beneficial, but they are quite pricey in nature. All right, then you have, for example, your most of your fruits and veggies. These are considered as low phenylalanine foods. Okay, so these are say more acceptable. Your high phenylalanine foods are all foods which are say rich sources of your protein. Obviously, this will include your meat and meat products. This will include dairy, but this also includes things such as lentil, chickpeas, legumes, and all of your vegan protein sources. Okay, now guys, you have to be very, very mindful. Although I have told you that fruit and veggies are free food and they can eat how much ever they want, but if you have a PKU patient who has severe PKU and has dietary intact protein restriction, say to approximately 4 grams of protein per day, or maybe say 6 grams of protein per day, then a food such as cauliflower can also turn into a high protein food for these patients. How? Let me just show you the working. Okay, so I'll just, yeah, open this for you. Let me see if I'm sharing the right thing. Yes, I'm sharing the right thing. Okay, so now guys, do you see this? So 100 grams of cauliflower. Okay, so have used this Fazan's website to identify what is the protein, say in a cauliflower. Okay, so I've used your the Australian Fazan's website. Okay, so now your 100 gram of cauliflower, it has 2 grams of protein. All right. So now 100 gram of cauliflower has 2 grams of protein and 73 milligrams of phenylalanine. All right. So it is more than say this 1 cup of pasta. Okay, but now guys, if your patient, hypothetically speaking, okay, if you have a patient who can only have 4 grams of protein per day, okay, very severe dietary intact protein restriction. So now this individual can only have 4 grams of intact protein. You give him cauliflower, 100 grams. Your 2 grams of protein are already used with this cauliflower. Does that make sense? So something which we wouldn't even fathom as say protein, like cauliflower and protein, you would never put these two things together, but you have to be so mindful with a PKU patient. All right. So obviously guys, not all of your PKU patients are on such severe restriction where they can have only 4 grams of protein. That is not the case. But this is just an hypothetical example for you to appreciate that foods which you never thought to relate to protein, you will have to respect those food in terms of protein, especially with PKU patients. Okay. All right. Okay. So now moving on to your medical formulas. Okay, these are also called as medical foods. They are also called as medical formulas. Okay, so now guys, your medical formulas, as I said, these are synthesized in the laboratory, just like how you have Sustagen and you have Ensure and things like that. They are similar in nature. Okay, so they could be available in liquid form, they could be available in powder form, they are also available in gel form. They have all essential, all of the other, say amino acids except phenylalanine. Your medical foods for PKU patients are phenylalanine free. Okay, so zero phenylalanine. All right, whereas I said when you have low protein foods, they have some amount of phenylalanine. It's not that they have zero phenylalanine. Okay, and the food industry, the packet, the phenylalanine they have calculated, please go by that, because they have actually analyzed the food sample and given you the phenylalanine value. In case if you do not have the packet and your patient is just saying, yes, I had a low protein cookie, but I forgot to bring the packet or something, then go with that formula, which is 1 gram of protein gives you 50 milligrams of phenylalanine. But if you have the packet, you should go via the packet phenylalanine values. You will be more accurate this way. Okay. So yes, guys. So yes, it has all essential vitamins, minerals, omega-3, and energy is there in carbohydrates. Now, guys, this also you will have to appreciate that, of course, now the phenylalanine, the medical food formula for phenylalanine patients, they are much more improved and more sophisticated. Prior to this, the formulas, the carbohydrate which they used to provide was just glucose. So now imagine the patient generally has say around say 170 grams of this say protein. Okay, so they may have say maybe they are having say 50 grams or 60 grams in the morning and 60 grams in the evening. Okay, this formula they are having, medical formula, mixed with water or something like that. Okay, so now imagine they are having 60 grams of this formula, and this 60 grams of this formula, imagine they are having around say 80 to 100 gram of sugar in that, because it is only glucose. So previously these formulas, they were say designed in such a manner where the main source of carbohydrate was simple sugars, So therefore, you were having a lot of simple sugars. And when you have a lot of simple sugars, it's going to give you insulin spikes. You can have, say, other things which worrisome in the long term, which is such as overweight, obesity, insulin resistance, and so on and so forth. Okay, so now you have formula which have, say, fiber added to it, where they have, say, oligosaccharides in it, like inulin and fructans, and it is not just, say, simple sugars. So now they are coming with much better formula each day. So, but just to let you know that you still have to read those formulas, because some products, especially the cheaper one, the subsidized one, they may just have simple sugars. Okay, and there are certain formulas, guys, because I worked a lot in this space when I was in the US. You have certain formulas which are carbohydrate free as well. Okay, so for example, certain times as a dietitian, you can do various permutation and combination. So in the morning, say after a break, like, as a break fast. So, you haven't eaten the entire night, you may start with a carbohydrate formula. Then say maybe in between, you may have, say, a carbohydrate free formula. Then maybe again for your dinner, you may have a carbohydrate formula, but it is a bit more complex in nature with that fiber and things. So you can work with various permutations and combinations. Okay, so you do have the flexibility now. All right. So yes, guys, the amount of formula the person consumes, the type of formula the person consumes, this keeps changing depending upon the person's, say, age, say, life requirement. Maybe if a PKU patient you have is planning to conceive, or now is pregnant, is wanting to have a baby, things will change in that, say, perspective as well. Then depending upon their blood phenylalanine level, the medical formula, the proportions or the type will change. So there are a lot of factors to consider for the amount of formula you give them, the distribution of the formula you give them, the type of formula you give them. See, these principles of nutritional management, they stay very similar to, say, type 1 diabetes, okay? Because these are all of the different things that a diabetes dietitian considers, a diabetic educator considers in guiding the patient, right? So the principles of this remain the same even with these individuals, okay? Because they are meeting a lot of their nutritional requirement via external sources, okay? All right, guys. So guys, this is again just an example for you. Okay, so now if you have, say, classic PKU, where say the advice is not to go beyond 300 milligram per day of, your PKU diet, PKU, all right, intact proteins. So then, for example, if look at these regular brands, okay, so 1 tablespoon of peanut butter, regular brand, will give you 211 milligrams of phenylalanine in the diet. Okay, so in that 1 tablespoon of peanut butter. But when you have a low protein peanut butter, this will give you only 4 say milligrams of phenylalanine, okay, in the low protein version or the low Phe version. So low Phe or low protein, they are synonymous in nature for foods right now, because your protein, say, amount of protein will automatically go down. Okay, but guys, there are still, say, a lot of attempts being made by the research and food industries to say maybe have, say, good amount of protein level, but to have zero Phe. But currently we haven't reached that stage, but still research is going on. Okay, so guys, now if you see at the end, if you go for all regular brands, 952 milligram of phenylalanine is what the patient may consume. But if you go for, say, the low Phe or low protein brands, you have 61 milligrams of Phe. But please be mindful, guys, when you are a real life dietitian working with real life patients, you do not just say advise patients with all low protein foods, because a lot of patients, guys, you will have to appreciate, they cannot afford these low protein foods. Low protein foods, sometimes they become a delicacy. So if they really feel like eating a choco chip cookie, say maybe it's just like they can indulge themselves, say, 1 time or twice buying that low protein choco chip cookie, but it is not something they can do on a regular day-to-day basis. So dietitian has to work with a lot of tools, meaning to actually see how to minimize their dietary Phe intake via intact proteins using regular foods, all right, to introduce a lot of free foods. For example, depending upon their blood phenylalanine levels, your free foods could be, say, for instance, couple of fruits, or say salad items like green leafy veggies and things. But yes, so basically you have to play with a lot of permutation combination. You can't just take the easy road, give them an unrealistic diet that go and consume all of these low protein foods, but they can't afford it. So that's not a very realistic diet, right? So these are the things which you'll have to consider. If at all, like, you study medical nutritional therapy in the future and you're designing diet for your metabolic patients. Okay. All right, guys, this is just an FYI, a research which I wanted to share with you. Now the question comes upon how much do patients comply, okay, with your recommendation, which is which is a big thing, be it in any disease condition. Okay, so this research is what I had done in the United States, where we looked at the medical food intake and the intact protein intake among phenylalanine PKU patients, and we wanted to look at their body composition as well. All right, so I won't talk about body composition because it is not part of this, say, learning objective. But what I want to talk about is adherence to recommendations. Okay, so this were the, say, rough results which I saw. So I had an adult population with severe to moderate phenylketonuria, 27 of them. Okay, and then what they should be having, this was the advice, they should be having no more than 5 to 9 grams of protein per day. Okay, no more than 5 to 9 grams of protein, which is roughly, say, 250 to 400 milligrams of phenylalanine. But on the contrary, what were they having? Let us see that. Okay, so yes, the recommendation was, for example, no more than 9 grams of protein per day, right? But they were actually having, say, roughly 25 grams of protein per day. And this increased their Phe level to 1,250 milligrams of Phe, which they were having daily. And look at their Phe dietary recommendation. They shouldn't be having no more than 400 milligram of phenylalanine in their diet through intact protein, but this is what they are having through intact protein. So imagine the blood Phe levels and imagine the impact which this has on the neurocognitive system. Okay. Then you have medical foods. Patients were quite adherent to medical foods. So the recommended intake for them was roughly, say, you need to have 60 grams of your medical protein per day, your medical formula. Okay. They were having on an average 53, which was not bad. And as you know, medical formulas, they do not have any Phe. So of course, they did not have any Phe in their medical formula. But you see that it is so difficult to stay on a low protein diet. Just like how for a diabetic individual, it is so difficult for a diabetic individual to regulate their carbohydrate intake. Similarly, PKU individuals have issues with regulating their protein intake. Okay, so these problems are very realistic and faced by metabolic dietitians, genetic metabolic dietitians, day in and day out. Okay, so now guys, this is the emphasis which I want to give, that PKU is a lifelong condition. Currently, we do not have a cure for it. All right, so right from the time the baby is born till they become, say, young adults, till they become mothers and the cycle continues, PKU management is a life cycle. Okay, it's throughout the life, and depending upon so many factors, the type of formula, amount of formula, distribution, all of that will vary. And guys, these pictures are taken with consent. This is when I was working at Emory University, where we used to organize metabolic camps. So let me just show you about metabolic camps. So yes, guys, so can PKU be, is there a treatment for PKU? Currently, there is not. Okay, as I said, there was a FDA trial which is going on regarding phenylalanine lyase injection, but this will be more as a management approach. It's just like how a type 1 diabetic individual takes insulin. Similarly, it's like you're taking an enzyme via injection. Okay, so yes, it will be managed, but currently there is no treatment. Okay, now guys, this is what I wanted to share with you, the metabolic camp. So we used to have once a year, we used to have an international metabolic camp. So young adults and say teenagers as well, youth, whoever were suffering from PKU, they were invited in this camp, okay, at Emory University. And we used to teach them about, say, different things. We used to teach them about healthy eating activities, what are the type of foods they can eat. then how they can cook these foods, and we used to teach them about medical formulas and how to prepare their medical formulas and how to consume them, the distribution of that, and a lot of lifestyle activities as well. Okay, so encouraging physical activity, etc. Because as I have said, a lot of these medical formulas, especially the subsidized one, they are so concentrated in like simple sugars, that we used to teach them about various things. So yes, predominant thing was education about phenylalanine, low protein foods, how to make a low protein diet from the naturally available sources. So this was my supervisor, Professor Rani Singh, who was my supervisor at Emory University. And these are all, say, the metabolic patients which we have. All right, so yes, and these are the medical formulas, guys. So as I said, the powder, you can convert it into liquid. So these are the liquids which you have. All right, so yes, guys, a very good initiative. And this is an international metabolic camp, meaning you had individuals coming from Spain and UK as well for this 1 week to join in the metabolic camp. So it is a very successful program and a very useful program. Successful in the sense how I say measure this success is how useful it is for individuals who want to learn more about their management of their condition. Okay, so yes, now there are other amino acid metabolic disorders. As I said, there are even fatty acid disorders. I'm not going into that. Otherwise, your brains will get fried. Okay, so let's not do that with you. Okay, but let me just touch base upon various other metabolic disorders related to amino acids, because our focus has been, say, protein. All right, so yes, then you have homocysteinuria. All right, so it is so interesting that let me share this with you. At a Royal Brisbane Women Hospital, when I was working, I had an outpatient who had homocysteinuria. And as a early career dietitian, I was asked to see this patient with homocysteinuria. And because it was my first time dealing with, say, a individual with a nutrition related genetic metabolic disorder, I did so much of reading, I did so much of homework, and I went into the setting. I thought that it may not be useful because this is a regular patient and I'm just a change in dietitian. So the earlier dietitian had some other role, so she left. So I had taken her place. So I thought that although I have done my homework, it is for my own knowledge. I don't think so. The patient who's been seeing this service for a long time would be needing this sort of education. But after some say discussion, I felt that they don't really understand what the condition is. And then just like what we do in the lectures where we break down the sciences into very simple terms using analogies in your tutorial, that's the same thing which I did with the patient. And she was so thankful and relieved because she finally, after so many years, understood what is exactly happening to her. All right. And for example, then she followed everything so stringently. She was so adherent to her diet. She was an amazingly bright teenager. Like, she was fantastic. Okay. She just needed the right knowledge and direction. So basically, she understood why she is doing and why am I asking her to do XYZ, rather than dictating this is what you need to do and not explaining the reason, the underlying reason, pathophysiology behind it. So after that, we thought this would really improve her blood homocysteine levels and it would be good. But it was so surprising that when she went for a blood test, they were still higher. Then I again went back to my books and I did more research, and I found out that you shouldn't be doing, say, homocysteine level testing on only empty, say, a fasting state. Okay, you need to do it on both and need to see a comparison. So we did that. And yes, her homocysteine level with the correct state, which was not the fasting state, it came out to be normal. Okay, and we were so happy. So basically, guys, what am I trying to say is, as a dietitian, you not only need to know the dietary management, yes, you not only need to know how to communicate that dietary management to your patient, but you need to know a lot of interpretation behind the biochemistry and the blood results. For example, when the patient came to me and the poor thing was saying that I followed everything to the T which you've been telling me for the past 4 weeks, but still I have high homocysteinuria level, then I really went to the details of the blood test. Okay, when was it done? How was it done? And what were her conditions, etc., etc. And then I said, okay, try ask your GP. I cannot recommend a blood test. Ask your GP if it would be useful for you to do a blood test, say not at a fasting, but say at a regular state, which is say 2 hours after meal and things like that, just a regular normal state. And your GP said, yes, let's try that. And then the GP also said that, yeah, it would be good to do homocysteine, not just fasting, but even postprandial, because that will give a more holistic picture. So guys, basically, it's just like you need to have an understanding of a lot more components as a dietitian, not just this is the disease, I have told this diet and that's about it. No, like investigate what's going on. Sometimes a GP may not catch it, but you may catch it. And if you have a discussion then with your with the GP, the patient's GP, they are very willing to, like, you know, means say recommend another test and things like that, which is what they can do. It's not our job, but you can at least have a healthy discussion, an informed discussion, knowledgeable discussion. All right. So yes, with homocystinuria, you have methionine, which is converted to homocysteine in all of us with the methyl group transferase enzyme. And you have homocysteine, which is converted to cystathionine with the enzyme cystathionine synthase. Okay, now when you do not have cystathionine synthase, or you do not have methyl group transferase, that is when you have the condition called homocystinuria. Okay, so that's why it's important for you to remember these enzyme names. Because if I didn't know about all of this, I wouldn't know what the blood test is talking about. It is because I knew what this is, I could interpret the blood test. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Then you have maple syrup urine disease, okay, which is again a common one with amino acid metabolic disorders. Over here, you have concerns with your branch chain amino acid. Which are your branch chain amino acid? They are your leucine, isoleucine, and valine. Okay, so now these are converted into the byproducts, succinyl-CoA and acetoacetyl-CoA by the enzyme branch chain alpha keto acid dehydrogenase. Yes, you need to know this also. And if this is not there, that is when the problem happens. Because in the blood test, they will be writing these terminologies. Okay. Then you have tyrosinemia type 1, which again is in your 29 core conditions. Okay, so tyrosinemia is converted to fumaric acid and acetoacetic acid, and this is done by the enzyme fumaryl acetoacetate hydrolase. Okay, and when you have a deficiency of this enzyme, that is when you see tyrosinemia happening. Okay, so yes, guys, that's it. That is your last SSML lecture for this semester. And the next lecture, which I'm covering on GI disorder, that is only a complimentary lecture, a free lecture, all right, which is not part of your exams. So don't worry about it. But yes, those who are going into clinicals, please do see this lecture whenever your time permits. It will be helpful for you. All right, so yes, guys, that's from my end. And I'll see you very soon in the tutes. Okay, thank you.